great to be out of Florida. It's great to be someplace that has fall weather, because we don't have that in Florida. We just got out of the 90s last week and hit the upper 80s this week. So I want to tell you about the Jankola Library project and how I got involved in it. And that came from my interest in genealogy, which happened very late in my life. And then I started using newspapers to find family information. That showed me how important they were. And then I started working with the Czech and Slovak Genealogy Society on their preservation project for Czechoslovak newspapers. And that led me to the Jankola Library, where I was looking for the Jednota newspapers, which you can see right in front of me, one of the bound copies. Of the 120-year publication of that newspaper, they have about 100 years worth at Jankola Library. That's what I went there for, and I was surprised to learn that the library was soon to be closed and the property soon to be sold. So my efforts switched from preserving the Jednota to preserving the entire contents of the library. And fortunately, there is a plan now for preserving all that material. And there's a lot to be done, so I'll describe for you what's going to be happening in the future with all that material. So, how I got involved, I'm both Czech and Slovak, but I knew very little about my Czech and Slovak ancestry. I grew up in Washington, D.C. Both of my parents, my dad's Slovak, my mother's Czech, Bohemian, knew very little about their ancestry because they lived in Washington, D.C. and were somewhat separated from their ethnic communities. So when I did retire in 1999, I made my first discoveries of my family history. And that was only possible because in 1989, you remember the Berlin Wall came down, and that was the first opportunity to really do research in Czechoslovakia. So in 1989, I was still working. I started studying Czech and Slovak languages, which was very fortunate to be in Washington to do that, because I studied Slovak with the first teacher hired by the Foreign Service to teach the American diplomats who were going to be going to Bratislava to work in the new Slovak embassy there. So I studied Slovak with her, and then the Department of Agriculture graduate school taught classes in 26 languages, one of which was Czech. So I also was able to study Czech while I was here. And then when I retired in 1999, I switched my efforts over to studying family history. And on my very first trip to the U.S. Archives with a genealogist from West Virginia who was leading a group there, I made my first discoveries. And it was the discovery of where my Slovak ancestors came from in Slovakia. My dad didn't know, my mom didn't know where her family came from in Bohemia. So it was a great find to finally figure that out. And it turned out that my Slovak ancestors were from the town of Dubrava, and it was this ship record that led me to it. It was when my grandfather's older brother arrived in Baltimore in 1899 from Slovakia. It listed his town of origin as Dubra, which I ultimately concluded was Dubrava. And there are 4 Dubravas in Slovakia, but my dad knew his dad was from the area around Košice, so the closest Dubrava was in County Spiš, near Spiš Castle. That was the Dubrava where they came from. So right there, that great discovery led me down the track of Slovak ancestry. And that's where Dubrava is. It's reputed to be the water source for Spiš Castle, because it's in the side of a hill, water springs from the mountain there, and that water was supposedly piped to Spiš Castle, because a castle sitting on a hill has no water supply. So water has to be piped in. So that's the Dubrava. His wife came from Nizhny Slavkov, which I thought was quite a ways north of Dubrava, and I was surprised how they were able to ever meet, but they met and were married and immigrated with their 5 children to the United States. So that's my family history of Slovak. My mother's family history was a lot harder to discover. Everything I found in American papers only listed their place of origin or place of birth as Czechoslovakia. Not much help. So by piecing together the date of her death, my great-grandmother's death, that my aunt helped me with, the newspapers, Cleveland newspapers at the Library of Congress, going through page by page looking for obituaries, found her date of death. I still only had that she came from Slovakia. Death certificate said Slovakia. Everything I had only said Czechoslovakia. So finally, I found a Czech language newspaper in the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland. And in her Czech language obituary, it gave me the exact village, Kralova Lhota, in the Czech lands, Bohemia, as where she came from. And that's a village of only about 350 people. So had it not been for this Czech language newspaper, I would still be looking for where this village is. And then my great-grandfather, who died much later, 1954, I wasn't sure there was a Czech language newspaper, but there turned out there was. And so I found his village. And again, this is where my study of the language really helped, because he came from Ze Starého Sedla. So you won't find Starého Sedla on a Czech map, but you will find Staré Sedlo, which is the dictionary form of that town name. So if I hadn't known that, I might have still been looking on maps everywhere for Starého Sedla. But because I knew enough of the language, I knew how the languages were grammatically declined, the nouns and the verbs. Some of my own ancestors who came to this country didn't even know that. They constantly correcting me on what the name was, and I had to tell them a name has many different forms. And they said they never knew that because they had never studied the language. So that village is south of Prague, about an hour-and-a-half drive south of Prague. And I've been able to visit all these villages. Some of the ancestors came from the village of Radava, but unfortunately that village is under this lake. This is the Vltava River, which goes through Prague, and has been dammed in the late 30s, and that village is underwater. So I was not able to view any family homes or churches from that village. But that shows you how, over time, things will change. So this made it clear to me how important newspapers were. Of course, you go for vital records, birth, death, marriage records, new family history, but you also get a lot of information from newspapers. The number one thing you get is an obituary. If you find an obituary, it is just chock full of information about the family, where, surviving members of the family, dates, even the fraternal societies that they belong to. That was all in those newspaper article obituaries that I found from my great-grandparents. But you also get announcements of other life events. You can get news stories if they happen to be elected leaders or political figures or celebrities. You get newsworthy events. That's been a gold mine for me. Traffic accidents, trials, tragedies. All of these things will be reported in newspapers. Advertisements, if they ran businesses. You'll find out what businesses they ran. You can get legal notices like divorces, wills. I've even found real estate transactions where we knew both of my great-grandfathers had farms and we never knew where they were until I found the real estate transactions in newspapers. And then you get the just cultural, general historical and cultural background for the countries. So how do you search newspapers? Well, the way you used to search newspapers was go to a library and find a reel of microfilm and just start scrolling through it. But boy, if you don't have the approximate date and place where it happened, you're not going to find it. So then became online searching of digitized newspapers. This only started maybe 20 years ago. And with that, you can just type in names or keywords, and it will find those names or keywords where they appear in newspaper articles of the past. I refer you to this magazine because it has probably the greatest article on sources of material for searching old newspapers. Please, look for it at a library, or if you have a genealogy society, you may. I belong to a genealogy society, and we have this in our collection. and I recommend it to everyone in our group and any of you who are looking for newspaper information. So what's available free? Premier source, Chronicling America through the Library of Congress. Another free one done by just a volunteer who takes microfilm reels and digitizes them is a guy named Fulton in New York, and he has digitized newspapers for a lot of these states shown here. Look how limited this is though. Look, Chronicling America, 3,800 titles, Fulton, 1,000 titles, they're free, and the dates are somewhat limited, only up to 63 for Library of Congress, and I'm sure that has to do with copyright protections. But then when you get into paid subscriptions, look at some of these. Genealogy Bank, 15,000 titles. Newspapers.com, 25,000 titles. Newspaper Archive, and I really like this one because it's done a lot of smaller town newspapers where I've been able to find a lot of information. And look at the date ranges from 1690 all the way to the present for these. These cost money, but if you belong to a genealogy club or through your local library, you often will have access to these. There are some limitations in using newspapers, especially for doing Slovak and Czech research. Only a very, very few Slovak language materials have ever been digitized. Lucky for me, one that was digitized was Youngstownské slovenské noviny, Youngstown Slovak News. And that my mom and dad came from Youngstown. And they lived there, and their parents lived there during those dates, 1910 to 1940. So I've been able to find information in Slovak about my family, from that newspaper. The only two Czech, no, these are also Slovak, the Western Reserve Historical Society, but these are on microfilm. The Voice from Cleveland, Ohio, and Denny Floss, also from Cleveland, Ohio. What's in Western Reserve in Cleveland is mostly Cleveland-related materials. The other problem with newspapers is pretty much guaranteed that about 90% of it's not right. Because newspaper stories are hearsay. They're one reporter's take on a story that he has maybe 30 minutes to prepare by talking to whoever he can find in the vicinity of the event. So they're generally not correct. So you have to fact check everything. The things that are usually correct are the date and place, because newspapers are printed in a place and they're printed on a specific day. So that information is usually right. But all the other information is suspect. So when I found the story of my grandfather's automobile accident in Youngstown, Ohio, and my aunt, his living widow, his daughter, his surviving daughter, who remembered the story, she gave me the date. I was able to find the story, and she read it and said, "I don't understand how they got all the information wrong." So that's why I say you have to take it with, and this goes even for obituaries, because it's a family member writing the obituary, and he may know very little about the family. So even obituaries are not correct. You have to use the obituary to track down the more valid source of the information. So that's what newspapers are good for. And the other problem with using newspapers, that process of digitization requires what's called optical character recognition. So it's taking an image of the print and converting it to text, and then you're searching for the text. That process is anywhere from only 25% to 95% accurate. You know, even when you look at a piece of newspaper print, can you correctly identify every letter in it? Probably not. And I'll show you some examples of how far off it can be. And then especially for a language like Slovak, which has all these diacritical characters, it's very hard for OCR to get all that right. But it's much better than any other way of looking for this information. And the kind of things you can find are truly amazing. Like this. These are just some newspaper headings, all related to family members of mine that I have found in newspapers. Area newlyweds die in turnpike crash. I didn't know them. They are my dad's second cousins. he was only 21 and his wife was 19, and they'd been married 3 months, and they both died in an automobile accident on the Ohio Turnpike. And 5 years later, the Ohio Supreme Court action is the final resolution of the court case where the driver of the truck was determined not to be liable for the accident. So those two articles put that story together for me and for his other surviving relatives who I was able to give this information to. My grandfather's brother was involved in a serious accident, automobile accident in Youngstown, Ohio, 4 injured near Jackson, where a car collided with a motorcycle, and my grandfather's child was declared dead at the scene. But once he got to the hospital, they repaired his skull, and he actually survived and has like 25 descendants now, living descendants. So again, quite an interesting revelation story. And this is the one about my grandfather, the one that had the automobile accident. Has vacation in hospital. He had the accident the last day he worked before he was going on vacation. And that's the one my aunt says, no, it was all wrong. So here was a real estate transaction. So how on earth did, the top one there, how on earth did OCR get that right? But it managed to pick out the name Styndall, S-T-Y-N-D-L, who's my great-grandfather. And that was where I was able to determine where his farm was located in Cleveland, which otherwise we never knew. And then the second one, another great-grandfather who also had a farm, and I found where his farm was from newspaper articles. And this is the record of his death. And it totally inverts our understanding of how and where and when he died, the circumstances of his death. Because we did not know that he died of an illness. We thought he died of a mill accident. And so this corrected that information, and this was only available in the Slovak newspaper that I could find. And then his farm went up for sale, and he sold all of the implements and livestock at his farm 6 months before he died. So that indicated he was ill, and he was going through a long illness, and he died later, and then had to sell the farm. And his widow ended up selling the farm. This was just a very fluke finding. Grandfather and his brother-in-law. Shoots companion on dare. You cannot hit anything, said Steve Baluch, happens to have the same name as me, my grandfather, to his companion, Andy Smigovsky. Steve jumped up on the stump and said, go ahead, shoot. Andy did, and shot him in the shoulder. My grandfather was 15, and Andy was 16, and Andy was his brother-in-law. So that's just some of the things that I found. So my experience with using newspapers really told me this is stuff that you got to save. So the first things I started thinking about saving were the Shepherdstown newspapers where I used to live. This was a little local newspaper called the Shepherdstown Good Newspaper. Christopher knows it very well. So I first was involved in an indexing project to index their stories because they've been publishing for like 20 years. Even the editor couldn't find the stories that he had written in the past. So he wanted to put together a whole index, which we started to do. Well, the index isn't all that helpful, but over the course of several years, it finally stopped publishing about 5 years ago. I managed to get a hold of every issue and scan every issue, and every issue is now digitized and text searchable on the internet. And it's all just human interest stories. It's just stories about people in that town and everything about them. And it's just a gold mine for researchers, genealogists of the future. The other one that I scanned, this one, the Island Sandpaper, went out of business at COVID. And I'd always liked this newspaper because they did have very good, high-quality obituaries. And obituaries in Florida can be people from everywhere because everybody ends up in Florida. So as soon as I saw they were going out of business, I got in touch with the editor and asked if there was any way we could get all of that information scanned. And we managed to get it all scanned 1 year before Hurricane Ian hit and wiped out almost every surviving copy of this newspaper. And this is the history of that town for 20 years, which no longer exists. And then the Shepherdstown Chronicle I scanned. I had the copies with me when I moved to Florida. And when my wife passed away, she was a children's librarian in Shepherdstown. So this newspaper was full of stories about her. So when I got to Florida, I said, I'm going to scan these newspapers so I can save them and share them with her relatives, of which she has many. And as I'm scanning the newspapers, I found out that she has cut out all the articles about the library and taken them to the library. And so I'm sitting here with a newspaper full of holes. Luckily, the Shepherd University Library had a complete set of these newspapers, and I was able to visit them, and they allowed me to scan the missing pages. And so now I have a complete set of this for about 20 years of their 40 years of publication. So those are my early scanning projects. They were all English language. Then I volunteered with the Czechoslovak Genealogical Society International, who had begun some scanning projects. Their first project was Hospodář magazine, which is a Czech language newspaper. It's been published over 100 years, almost all in Czech. It gradually switched to English. They managed to get rights to publish it and put it on the internet and to scan it. And I scanned about 20 years worth of that publication. And then now they're working on a project to digitize the 100 years of Denní Hlasitel, which is another Czech language newspaper from Chicago. And this particular issue of their magazine, Naša Rodina, has a list of all of the scanning projects and preservation projects that they're involved in, including this one that I'm talking about today. I'm in here in Genealogists of the Present, Preserving News of the Past. That's my story, and that's what I'm talking about today. But there's also all the other projects that they're involved in. Growing out of that, when I went to their 2022 annual meeting, we managed to put together a group of volunteers who would spend their time finding Czech and Slovak newspapers published in the United States that might still be available in some fashion, or if they're not available in microfilm or online, where there might be paper copies. So we had about 10 volunteers, and they're scattered around the country, and they specifically work in the publications in their own states. And so we're trying to put together a list, a composite inventory of where all this material exists that was published in Czech and Slovak in the United States, and where it's preserved, how to find it, and to get as much of it scanned as possible, and to find the paper copies if they still exist. It's been fairly easy to find newspapers, regularly published periodicals, magazines. What's been harder to find is like newsletters. Newsletters of fraternal organizations, Catholic parishes that were Czech and Slovak, which are full of member news, and those are really hard to get. And that's why you need somebody embedded in the towns or states where these things were published to find those things. Even in Florida, we have 2 newsletters that were published there, one in Czech and one in Slovak, which are just local newsletters for the Czech community and the Slovak community. And those are things that are just easily lost if they're not collected and scanned and preserved. And I'm working with the Florida group on the Slovak one there, which is the Slovak Garden near Orlando, Florida. So once we find whatever paper copies are available, the next step is to get them all digitized. So the first project that grew out of this effort to find these things and scan them was the American Sokol organization contacted me and said, would you scan our publication, 120 years worth. So I went up to their office in Chicago and in 2 weeks scanned 120 years of their publication. And that publication has now been digitized and distributed to the Iowa Museum and to the National Museum in Prague, except for about 10 issues, printed issues that have never been found. We still might find them in a library somewhere. We think the Wisconsin Library might have them. So that's been completed in 2023. The next one that I wanted to get involved in was Jednota, because I knew Jednota was distributed nationally. Every state in the country, I think, had Slovaks that subscribed to it. It was published for over 120 years. It's still published, originally in Slovak, now switched mostly to English. And it was published in Middletown, Pennsylvania, mostly. So finally, even though I knew Jankola Library existed, I had never been there. And even though I lived in Washington, D.C., I had never been there. So I knew they had them. I called Sister Loretta and I said, I would like to come and see what you have for Jankola and see what I could scan. She of course, invited me to come, very gracious to put me up even at the convent to work on this. But unfortunately, what I found were these great big bound books of the Slovak of the Czech, of the Jednota newspaper. And with the scanning equipment that I had, I could not do it. I mean, those books are too unwieldy to get under the scanner, turn the pages, get them to lay flat. But you can see that the quality of the print is very, very good. In fact, she let me take this one, which was an extra copy, and I was planning to take it home and cut the pages out of this book so that I could scan it. Because all the print material at some point is going to be useless because it's going to disintegrate. But I was able to scan, there were several years that she had some loose copies, and I was able to scan some of those. And the quality for those, even though the condition of the material was very, very bad, the newspaper paper is just crumbling in your hands, I was still able to get some pretty decent scans for that material. And now Jednota itself, some volunteers in Jednota are trying to get that whole publication scanned. So I probably work some more with them. But this was what I was able to get from the Jednota. And actually, you know, when you get this scan on the image, you can blow up the image, and this text is very readable. And this is from 1893, which is the second year of publication. And you can see I could only get a half a page because wherever the paper's creased, it's just falling apart. So, so what I have to do is scan the top and the bottom pages separately. This was a great find in that publication. This is the list of all of their local chapters in 1893. So it tells you all the places that had a Slovak community, that had members that were members of Jednota. And a lot of them are also Catholic parishes, because Jednota is a Catholic organization, First Catholic Slovak Union. So I immediately looked up Youngstown, which is where my family came from. And they had the chapter, St. Martin's chapter. Unfortunately, when I did a text search for Youngstown, nothing came up, and that's because that's the way the OCR translated that page, which is not surprising because the print on this page is about the most microscopic print that you can imagine. And how it is so legible even at this date. I mean, I can read it perfectly well, but the OCR didn't do a very good job. But I actually put it through a second OCR reader, and I got a much better copy. And then I was able, because of my knowledge of Slovak, to correct it. So now I have a fully corrected copy, and it's very readable, and it's full of the members, you know, just like the officers of your organization elected today. These are the officers that were serving in that branch in 1893. And they're all their names, and one of them is a relative, Jan Smigovsky. He's that brother-in-law of my grandfather. That's his family, Smigovsky. And again, error. It's Smigovsky up here, S. Hatchek, and down here it's Smigovsky with no Hatchek. So I don't even know which one is correct. And every town in English is totally misspelled. It's like written phonetically. Hubbard, Ohio up here was really Hubbard, Ohio, and Lovellville up here is really Lowellville. And of course I can look those names up on a map and correct them as well. So, but now I got this perfect snapshot of that branch in 1893 and even some family members that might be involved in it. And so, and then I can put the whole text into Google Translate and translate it in English. And anybody can do that once you find the stuff you want to translate. So, here I am working on Jednota, and Sister Loretta shares with me, there's something going on at our convent that you might be interested in. But that's all she would say. The next day she said, well, it might be going to be sold. And then the next day she said, it's going to be sold. So that's how I found out. So surprise, surprise. And I thought, what's going to happen to all this stuff? She says, I don't know. Well, I found out that Sister Barbara, who was the head mother of the order, had already made some contacts about places where the material could go. And the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, has agreed to take all of the print material. And so that material has begun to be removed in 2023 and 2024, and your members helped with that, packing some of it up. 2 shipments have already been sent, which is about half the print materials, and there were 2 basement rooms, which is what we worked on, which was, well, not too polite way of saying it, it was a dump. It was just where all kinds of excess print material had been placed over the years and hadn't been touched in many, many, many years. So that's where I knew that material was going to take some time to get organized, and that's what I spent this past summer doing. So there's some upsides and downsides to this. At the National Museum and Library, it's going to be well protected because it's a well-funded organization and it's professional staff. You know, they're librarians, so they're going to take care of this stuff. They're going to preserve it, they're going to organize it. And they're going to make it available for research. And there's a lot of duplicates in the material, and they will be able to manage getting that around to other repositories that might be interested in it. So there's some definite pluses to having it go there. Some problems with it going there. There's a lot of stuff they're not going to be taking. There are probably 500 Bibles there in Slovak. Well, after they took 5, they didn't need 495 more. So all those are going to be left, and a lot of prayer books. And there was a whole room which was just new books they used to sell. So that was still to be resolved. So I'll tell you what's going to happen with that. And then they have a museum there, and they have some beautiful material in their museum. And there's nobody that's agreed to take the material out of the museum. So right now it's kind of up for grabs. But it's any place they've looked at that might be interested is a museum that also has a lot of stuff that they're not able to take care of. So that's a real problem with what to do with Slovak museum pieces. And then the other problem with it going to Iowa is the Slovak descendant communities are in the Northeast. They're not in Iowa. They're not in the western states. So it really has moved this material a lot farther from all of us who have interest in it. So it's going to be harder for us to access it. But if we're successful in getting it scanned, it will eventually be on the internet where we'll be able to search it. So this is what the Villa Sacred Heart, where the Jankola Library is located, and what's there was they had a girls' boarding school, which finally closed in 1999. They have the Congregation Cemetery, which is where all the sisters who lived and worked there are buried, passed away there. And they have this beautiful basilica, which was built in the 1930s. I mean, it is as beautiful as any church in this country. And one of the conditions on the sale is these things have to remain, the cemetery and the basilica, which is going to make it somewhat hard to sell this property. But the library itself had a very well-organized library of mostly Slovak language material, maybe 75% Slovak, 25% English. The only record of it was a card catalog, index cards. But it had at least 10,000 books and articles covered there, and on 12,700 cards. And that really was the only thing there at the library that didn't have a digitized record. So what I did last year was scan the entire card catalog so that it can be searchable as a PDF file. The periodicals room, so that had all these bound Slovak books. Look at how many of them. And there's 74 pages of just lists of periodical material that's in their inventory. It's more than 200 individual titles. And it's substantial runs of these things, not just a few issues. So great, and this has already been moved to Iowa, so it's gone. It has this overflow room, stuff that never made it into the card catalog. And there's probably 10,000 items there. And there is a paper list of those. And Helen is doing very well going through this list, trying to find out if any of these materials have been cataloged, which will help David catalog them in the Iowa library. So those are the four main things. The sale books are not going, they're staying there. And I'm going to be dealing with those, I'll tell you how. And then this was the cellar storage. 2 rooms, stuff was piled floor to ceiling, and I mean literally to the ceiling. We had to pry boxes that were stuck to the ceiling to get them out of there. And then we had to empty all these boxes, sort all the material, and then repack it so it could be shipped. And I had 2 sets of volunteers, the SSW volunteers and another group from outside Pittsburgh, and we were swimming in boxes, and we were crawling, climbing to the ceiling, and then we were packing up boxes, and as we were packing boxes, one morning we woke up to the floor flooded. Oh. So we didn't lose any material, but we had to repack material because it soaked the bottom of the boxes. The place hadn't flooded in 12 years, and it flooded that week. And this is what we ended up with. Both rooms, spick and span. The one on the left top there is mostly the new materials. Those have to still be disposed of. The boxes piled in the middle of the right side room is what's left to be pulled out of boxes and packed. And then 170 boxes were packed and ready to ship. And what was in those, so look at where we went from. We went from that to that in a month's time. And with some great volunteers. I mean, without the volunteers, it would not have been possible. Plus, I would have been crazy. Some great finds in this. Some real local newsletters. Wisconsin Slovak. You know, where are you ever going to find Wisconsin Slovak? Newsletters generally, 73 titles of just newsletters. Slovak, some English language related to Slovak, some related to Central Europe. Periodicals, 199 individual titles. Newspapers, 253 titles. There can't be many, and of course they're worldwide. These are not just United States, but worldwide. But there can't even be many Slovak newspapers beyond this list of 250. Some are only a single issue, or maybe only a single page, but just to know that publication existed is valuable in itself. And this is how they broke down for the ones that were in the United States. The most were in Chicago, unsurprisingly. Second most were in Pittsburgh, then New York City, and they were all about 20 each. Middletown, Pennsylvania, where a lot of them were published, about 20 there. Cleveland, 14. And then scattered almost everywhere else in the country, at least one publication of some type. One big important find for me was, well, these are the ones I thought were kind of most important. There was one from California, Czech and Slovak Club News. Great find, great to find and preserve. Because even in my family, there were Slovak members who went west, and we never heard from them again. And that's where they might be found in these publications. Wisconsin Slovak is another one that's, we'll have Wisconsin, which was not a particular stronghold of Slovak communities. That's a great one. Bridgeport, Connecticut, I knew was a big Slovak and Hungarian community, and as best I could tell, there was never a newspaper published there, and yet I found one here, the Telegram, published, and I have one issue from 1921. So I know there was a Slovak newspaper there, and now I know that somebody needs to go up there and track it down and find if more copies can be found. Then another one, a Slovak Catholic charitable organization, Naše Hlasy, was published in Chicago, and then another Slovak Heritage Association of the Laurel Highlands. So, great local source of local regional Slovak information from Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And then a parish newsletter, the Jednota St. Peter Society, or the branch from St. Peter's in Middletown, Pennsylvania. So these are kind of the rare things that I don't think you can find anywhere else, that we're able to find in this collection. And then we put together, this is how the boxes, what the final inventory of 170 boxes look like. So I have it sorted by newspapers, the titles of the newspapers, the titles of the newsletters, and the titles of the periodicals. And as I said, we came up with those numbers. So where do we go from here? Beyond those 4 rooms that I've already discussed, every time I'm up at Jednota, some worker tells me, well, what are you going to do with all those boxes of books out in the carriage house? And I always say, what books in the carriage house? And then we go look, and yes, there's a whole room full of books. and unfortunately exposed to humidity and not leaking roof, fortunately, but very badly disintegrating there. I was at least able to get the workers to pull the new books out of there, and actually absolutely huge atlas of all of the Czechoslovakia, which, like I said, we just can't leave these here to rot. So we got some good things out of there, but what will ever happen to the rest of those is really hard to say. So the new books, Sister Barbara has agreed, I offered this to her, that I would take all the new books around to all Slovak festivals and sell them until they're gone. If we agreed, we would split the proceeds 50-50, because that will help me cover my expenses of doing that, and it will give some money back to the convent. And just for whatever we can sell them for, for reasonable prices. And she was very agreeable to that. In fact, she said, no, I don't like that. We want you to get all your expenses. And I said, well, I would too, but I don't want to have to keep track of my expenses. So I really would rather just go 50-50 with you. So that's what we decided to do. And that's why you have some books here. And then the Bibles, prayer books, catechisms. We could probably fill 50 boxes with those. And I'm going to bring what's ever in new condition, I'm going to bring it around and try to sell it. But, 90% of that stuff is just not going to be saved. And then there are just excess copies of a lot of things, because they were schools, so they might have classroom materials that they use for their class, and they might have 50 copies of a book. Well, after Iowa keeps a couple, they're not going to keep the rest. David Molina at the library out there said, send extras, because I know I can find other institutions that will want some of these. So we did send extras, but we still have a lot of extras left. And then there's the museum items, and I don't know what's going to happen to those, and that's still something to be resolved. Now that the library in Iowa has these things, what are they going to do? They got to unpack all these boxes. They got to organize them. They got to sort them. They got to catalog them. They got to get them into their system. They got to redistribute the excess materials. They are going to make them available for researchers to come. And I did get the library catalog, at least the cards, onto a searchable file. So now you can reasonably easily find books that are in that main library collection. And now, their next step, and big one, is to get all this periodical material scanned. That's the only way that we permanently preserve and accessible to everybody on the internet. So I just love, this is the quality of their card catalog, which I just can't even believe it when I look at it. They had a typewriter that made all the diacritical marks. Unfortunately, OCR didn't pick them all up, because if you see the mech chain over the ZCS, it's too high above the letter. And so the OCR doesn't think it's connected to that letter, so it's not picking up all those things. It did pick up the diligence, the long mark on the vowels. It did pick those up. But it's an absolutely beautiful, it's just scanned beautifully. And it's kind of just a side note. The typewriter was invented by somebody from Danville, Pennsylvania, named Christopher Scholes. He was working in Wisconsin when he got his first patent in 1868. But that was the birth of the typewriter, which was very interesting. I just happened to go by that marker. Somebody said to me today, there's another library. Yeah, there is. The Benedictine Order of Cleveland has the Slovak Institute, which has a library, and it may be comparable in size to what's at Jankola. I've never been there. I'm not sure I want to go there. But for one thing, it's much later. It came about in 1952, so it can't possibly have a lot of the earlier stuff, although it might, because Janota didn't publish all that stuff. It just got dumped on them, and they might have more stuff that goes back. The other thing they might have is more Ohio stuff, and that's very much of interest to me. So eventually I will get there. And I understand from people that have been there, their material is not getting a lot of care either. It's basically sitting in a warehouse. People can come use it if they wish, but it's not getting a lot of care and, kind treatment, shall we say. So, but you can contact them and go see it. I will eventually get there. But just a reminder, if you want to see more information about searching historical newspapers, Family Tree Magazine, and then Nasze Rodiny, the Czechoslovak Genealogical Society International, from March of this year. It has good articles on those things. And so that's how I got involved, how important newspapers are. Czech and Slovak newspapers are very rare to be found, but when I found them at the Jankola Library, they're going from the Jankola Library. So now they all have to go to Iowa, and now what's there has to all be sorted out. And then we have to figure out what to do with the rest of the stuff. That's where we are. Thanks. So if you have any questions or you just want to chat afterwards, I'd be glad to.
What kind of equipment do you use to...
I have a book scanner. It costs $600. And it is, I would highly recommend it. It's great for newspapers. It takes the image from above. So you just turn the pages. And it goes zip, zip. That records the page. And then it does automatic optical character resolution. And it does it in Czech and Slovak languages. Well, it actually does Czech. But Czech is close enough to Slovak that I get a good image for even Slovak. And I get very, very, very good results. So good I bought a second one. Because I think I've just about worn out the first one. I don't know, I have probably scanned maybe 2 million pages of text with this thing. Maybe more. I mean, I have no idea even how to calculate it. But no, there is great equipment. But I don't have anything that can do this stuff. This bound stuff. I actually tried, I had to do some bound stuff from that newspaper in Fort Myers Beach because the only copy was bound in the library. And but I got such a distorted copy because you know see how fat these books are, they won't sit flat. The scanner tries to correct for that curvature, but it can't do it if it's too extreme. So, and boy, like I say, that was the most fortunate thing that I scanned because shortly after I finished scanning it, basically every print copy was wiped out. So it just wouldn't exist. And even the electronic copies I had given them, they were in the same box as the papers, so they're gone too. So as soon as they regrouped, I went back to the Historical Society. I said, in case you lost your newspapers, here they are. And they fit on a flash drive. You know, 20 years worth of this publication fits on a flash drive. And it's because it's English language and it's very good text quality, it's a very good OCR. So you can find anything in it. And it's got great color pictures. It's got pictures of things that no longer exist in that town. So, I mean, that's the value of doing this. So, yeah.
From a technical perspective, I imagine that...
Wait, I'm going to come closer so I can hear you better.
From a technical perspective...
This room steals your voice.
From a technical perspective, I imagine that, you know, to get the quality that you need, that these are pretty large files. So I'm wondering where you store all of this and how does the book scanner that you use automatically name files in a way that it's logical and do you always have to do it in order? And I'm also wondering, like, what are some of the lessons you learned along the way that you're like, boy, I wish I had started doing this much sooner?
I could write a Bible, because I've been doing this for 10 years, and I've learned something. The number one thing I learned from the Shepherdstown Good newspaper, I used to do this. You know what I did? What did I do? I burned my tongue. There's acid in these papers. At the end of scanning for one day, my mouth was on fire. And I thought, what have I eaten? What have I eaten? A week later, I realized I had poisoned my tongue with acid from these newspapers. I don't do that anymore. So that's lesson number one. Everybody needs to know that. But I learned every step along the way, ways to improve it. You know, doing the 2 pages. I've even corrected that now, how to fix that. You know, because you're going to lose at the crease. I figured out how to fix that. Yeah, so I learned. I mean, I could do a course just in how to do this stuff and naming the files. Now, of course, when I worked with Czech and Slovak Genealogy Society, they had set up rules for how they wanted things marked, and we did that. And quality. When I did the so-called for Chicago, I told Anna Kukaba, who was my coordinator there, what I wanted to do, and she says, "No, I think you should go for higher quality." I said, "Well, look, Anna, this is good enough, and it's what I use for most things." And she said, "No, if you're only going to scan this once, I think you should go for higher quality." And I did. I stepped up one. You have 4 levels. I stepped up 1 level. And it didn't really explode the files like I thought it would explode the files. And they still fit on 1 flash drive. So she was absolutely right. And I give her credit for pointing that out. And now that's even better quality than what I would have done. And like I said, it's only going to get done once. She said, do it. I couldn't go 1 more level, because if you go 1 more level, the files just get astronomical, and then you can't even search them. You just take forever to search them. So, but it was a very useful product. They were very happy with it, even though they were skeptical of me even doing it. They weren't sure. They said, "What's this nut doing? What does he want? He's trying to steal our stuff." So we had to go back and forth to even get them to allow me to do it. And then, oh, you can't take it off site. I said, well, you're not going to keep somebody in the office for 8 hours a day. You only have this office staff 1 hour a day. So we agreed I would pick it up every morning, take it to my hotel, scan it, bring it back the next morning, get another batch. And in 2 weeks, I got it done. I can't believe it. I got it done in 2 weeks. Now, I still spent another probably month after that just organizing the files. But it's done. I mean, it's done. And Jednota, that's another big one. And there are lots of other newspapers like this, and only 1 or 2 are available online. Only 1 or 2 of all that are out there, and they're just full of all this information that we need to preserve. So I'm just not going to let it get away. That's it.
Thank you. Your talk was fascinating.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So anything else? I'd be happy to stay and talk. I'm going to Pittsburgh tomorrow and sell more books.
You're increasing the supply of this information. Is there any way...
Disinformation?
No,
information.
This, I'm from Brooklyn, so forgive me.
Yes.
But what about the demand for it? Is there some way of tracking that this is really having an effect?
Well, yes, because, once the Czech and Slovak Genealogy Society puts something on the internet, they can track visitors to the site. And they take a different approach than David at the museum in Iowa. David's going to put everything he gets done on the internet for free. That's what they do. The Czech and Slovak Genealogy Society has been losing membership. You're lucky. You guys are increasing membership. I don't know how you're doing it, but you are. To get more members, they're advertising that they have it, and it's only available to members to search. So they're taking the approach, we can use this to market to get more members. And then they can track how much it gets used. I mean, the reason they wanted to do it was because they thought they would get a lot of obituaries in these publications. Turns out that some of these didn't, obituaries weren't that common until really the very late 1800s. And so some of these publications don't really have much in the way of obituaries. In fact, I think even Jednota only has like if you're an officer of a branch, do you even get an obituary in Jednota? It's not just every Slovak who dies. Another interesting thing that I found, I thought very interesting, is the United Mine Workers had a newsletter. And it was published in 3 languages. Every issue was 3 languages. Do you know what the 3 languages were? I think you can guess English.
Czech, no, Slovak.
Not Czech. Slovak. And what was the third? Italian.
The workers.
Published in 3 languages. And that's a Slovak publication that I don't even think Martin Javor has in his list, because he doesn't know that has Slovak. Every issue had 4 pages English, 4 pages Italian, 4 pages Slovak. So that's another great source of it, and a great find, something to even find out, through this project. So, anything else? Well, thanks a lot for coming. Thank you for a nice lunch.